Mars will be ruled by the Martians. People sometimes ask me, well, what kind of government is going to be on Mars? And I think there'll be many different kinds of governments on Mars. I think that different groups of people will emigrate to Mars with very different ideals as to what the ideal society should be and what the ideal government should be. And they'll give their ideas a spin. And those that prove to be unworkable, those colonies will either change their ideas or they will fade and die. And those that do the best will outgrow the rest. And they will become the model, not just for Mars, but I believe for Earth. Because why would someone move to Mars? They'll move to Mars if it's got something to offer that's better than what they've got where they are.
Hello, everyone. This is the Space Cafe podcast, and I'm Marcus. You know what's fascinating about our current march towards Mars via the moon? Everyone is watching Elon's Starship development like it's the final piece of a puzzle. But what if this is just the beginning? And in fact, this massive rocket, like the world has not seen before, is in fact the smallest of our challenges. And it's a daring assumption, but let's meet Dr. Robert Zubrin, the founder of the Mars Society and the mastermind behind the Mars Direct Mission Plan. So for decades, he showed NASA and the world how to get to Mars without breaking the bank. And today's conversation goes beyond just getting to Mars. It's a lot more about what happens after those first footprints, those first expeditions in the red dust. We're talking real challenges today, like nuclear reactors, energy production, food production, political frameworks, a new branch of human civilization. So, my friends, get ready for a reality check of a different kind about becoming a multi-planetary species. Welcome, Dr. Robert Zubrin, to the Space Cafe podcast. When do you realistically see the first human boots on Mars?
Well, from a technical point of view, we could have people on Mars within 10 years. There's no doubt about that. Yeah, sure, we could have people on Mars by 2032. It does need to be a joint program. The problem is that, okay, but while Musk is developing a transportation system, you need more than a transportation system to do a human Mars mission. You need all sorts of surface systems, including a nuclear power system, and which would be something very difficult to develop in the private or solely in the private sector, because it involves controlled materials. And there's a variety of other systems which in principle can be developed in the private sector, but there's a deterrent to, because unlike a launch system which has commercial applications, Mars surface systems don't really have that, and at least not at this point. And so we really need a public-private partnership here. And at this point, exactly how that can be arranged is unclear. But from a technical point of view, we could be there in 10 years.
Wow.
We could be there in 8 years.
Why wouldn't you see Elon also come up with, I don't know, a fusion reactor or a fission reactor or whatnot on Mars to push the boundaries even in these sectors, perhaps? I don't know.
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, Musk's primary interest in alternative energy is solar energy, which is not reliable on Mars because of dust storms. And also because the solar flux on Mars is only 40% that of Earth, even on a clear day. The issue, now, it must be said that even though Musk personally has not had much of an interest in either nuclear fission or fusion systems, he actually has done a lot of good for them by the example set by SpaceX, has caused people to start investing, for instance, in fusion power startups, because they looked at the success of SpaceX investors and said, hey, maybe the problem with fusion research is the same problem as with reusable launch vehicles. Not technical, it's institutional. We need to have an entrepreneurial approach. And so you do have fusion startups being funded by various investors. Some have gotten up to $800 million, funds actually larger than the government program, and they're operating on much faster timelines. So it is possible that as an indirect effect of the success of SpaceX, we will see fusion, well, if not commercial fusion power, fusion ignition this decade. But from a practical point of view, if we're going to have a near-term human Mars mission, we need a nuclear power source. It's going to be fission. And you see, the thing is a space nuclear reactor, if you want to keep it compact, you got to use highly enriched uranium. And not just the kind of stuff used in commercial reactors on Earth, which is typically about 3% enriched. You want something more like 90% enriched. And that stuff is very tightly controlled because that is also bomb-grade material. There are some ways around that. I mean, you could, for instance, contaminate it with plutonium-240, which would make it not useful for bombs, but still quite useful in a reactor. But that would be, once again, you're talking about doing stuff that and handling materials that is subject to rather tight controls.
So I guess the first expedition will most likely be a bunch of astronauts staying there for, I don't know, a couple of weeks or months in a very confined space. Yeah.
If the mission is done correctly, the flight plan should be 6 months to Mars, year and a half on the surface, 6 months back. You don't want to spend the majority of your Mars mission in space and only a small fraction on Mars. You wouldn't plan your vacation to Hawaii by spending 10 days at airports and 6 hours at the beach.
Of course. How many expeditions do you see before we get to Mars to stay on Mars?
Okay, well, here's the thing about that. I think if it was left entirely to governments, it might be a very large number of expeditions before anyone thought of establishing a permanent base on Mars, maybe 5 or 10. But here's the thing. You see, if Starship is successful, and I believe it will be, I mean, they've been working their way through the various problems. Each time they fly, it fails, but it fails further through the flight envelope. And so I think we're looking at a fully successful Starship flight to orbit, possibly even this year, but if not, first half of next year. So this is going to happen. And therefore, what is going to happen is it's going to be copied. Okay, the Starship will become a generic thing. Not immediately. There'll be several years in which SpaceX will have the only such thing. But after a decade or so, there's going to be Chinese knockoffs of Starships. You can bet on it. There's already 5 companies in China right now that have investor funding that are working on knockoffs of the Falcon 9, and which, of course, has been a great success, and therefore it's being copied. And within the United States, I mean, Blue Origin, the Glenn booster is basically an enlarged repeat of the Falcon 9, and so is the Rocket Lab Neutron. And so now that partially reusable space launch systems have been demonstrated to be successful, there are now going to be a variety of them. And similarly, there will be with the Starship type as well. And so here's the thing. Musk told me that he could build Starships, that is the upper stage, the part that in principle would go to Mars, for $10 million each, which means that either he or one of the copycats would probably be willing to sell it for $20 million each. And you have to understand that the advent of reusable space launch vehicles means that there's going to be something else new in the world, which is used space launch vehicles.
Interesting.
That has not been a thing up till now.
Like used cars.
Yes, exactly. You can't buy a used Saturn V. It does not exist. You can't buy a used Atlas. Okay, you can't, so you can't buy a used Proton. If they're used, they're gone. Okay, but used cars, of course, exist. And because they exist, people who could not remotely afford to buy a new car own cars. because you can buy a used car for 10% the cost of a new car. And so the same is going to be true of launch vehicles. And now once this thing has been proven by a series of expeditions, and once there's a lot of used heavy lift launch vehicles on the market, and at a certain point they will go on the market. What else would you do with it once you're done with it? The people who actually want to make a go of setting up a settlement on Mars will be able to buy one. And if these things can be sold for 20 million new, it means they'll probably end up being 2 million used. And okay, here's Starship, which is being vaunted as something that could transport 100 people to Mars. Well, 100 people divided into $2 million is $20,000 a person.
It's nothing.
Well, it's not nothing, but it's not an obstacle for someone who wants to pull up stakes and move and do a new start on a new world.
I think, if I remember correct, well, please do correct me. The Concorde airplane on an intercontinental flight was in its business class, pretty much along those, and this price tag, I think it was.
It might very well have been. I did recently check. A round-trip first-class air ticket from Los Angeles to Australia is about $20,000 right now.
There you go.
So there are people willing to pay that.
Of course.
Now, those, of course, are luxury travelers. Settlers typically will not be luxury travelers, but you should know that in the 1700s, the equivalent fare to travel by ship from England to America in terms of, in comparison to incomes, was about $300,000.
Wow.
And now $300,000, well, a middle-class person could sell his farm and raise that kind of money. Okay, once again, this is in equivalent to labor and so forth. Okay, income equivalent money. A working man would sell his labor for 7 years as an indentured servant. Okay,
well,
and you take 7 times, say, $50,000 today, that's $350,000. That is the kind of money that people are willing to spend if they want to just cash in their chips and move.
If you're ready to go to Mars, I guess, like the settlers back in the 1700s, they were ready to go to that new home for good. So they would sell everything back at home. So I think the investment is pretty realistic for even the worker if they sell everything they own in order to set up shop in the new world.
Yes.
If this comparison makes sense.
Yes. I mean, look, it's basically if you're rich enough to be a homeowner, and for instance, half of Americans are homeowners, okay, so we're not talking about the 1%, we're talking about the 50%. You could sell your house, and with the equity, you could buy your way to Mars.
Yeah. So let's go back to the expedition transitioning into an actual settlement. How quickly do you think can we scale from those expeditions into settlements for good?
Okay, well, I do see governments moving, that in our, for instance, we have this as a public-private partnership, moving to establish a permanent Mars base, okay? And a permanent Mars base would unquestionably offer bonuses to people who, instead of staying over the minimum time of 1.5 years, stay 4 years. We'll give you $1 million. Why not? Because it costs so much to transport them back and forth. Okay. So now you have people who would be staying on Mars 4 years, 6 years, okay, and then forming relationships on Mars and having children on Mars. And so a base could turn itself into a bit of a village that way and start to develop institutions, schools, and so forth. Certainly community theater. I mean, we even had that in World War II with people stationed in the Pacific and elsewhere. They'd create various institutions to maintain some form of cultural life while they were abroad. But the but but and that could conceivably grow into a actual settlement. But I think that the real settlements will come from private groups who, once they see that this technology is available, and they want to have a place where they could go to be able to make their own world. Okay, and that is the people who really do it. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the three most remarkable episodes of colonization, and by the word colonization, I use in the sense of settlement, not invading someone else's country and taking it over. Okay, but in the past 400 years, I would list the Pilgrims going to North America, the Mormons going to Utah, and the Jews going to Palestine, where none of these things were motivated significantly by economic considerations. They were they had an element of transcendence in them. That is, they had a religious motivation, but fundamentally, they were people who wanted to go to create their own world where they could live as they thought. A new start. And go to a place where the rules haven't been written yet, where they could write the rules, where they can make a start. And in all three of these episodes, I mean, the Pilgrims had already fled England for Holland, and the problem they were having with Holland was that the Dutch were too nice. They were being assimilated, and they said, "We got to get out of here." The Mormons who went to Utah, they could have gone to California or Oregon, which are much more fertile places, but they wanted to have a place of their own. And the Jews, instead of going to Palestine, it would have been much easier to go to New York. And but once again, they wanted to create something of their own. And so this will be a motivation. So you see, not everything that people do is practical in the nominal sense of, this is the best way to make money or the best way to have a life of security and comfort. I mean, there are certainly people motivated by that, but there are other people who are not motivated by that. There are other people who want to accomplish something really remarkable with their lives and are therefore willing to encounter discomfort, danger, whatever it takes in order to do that.
I'm wondering if we stay with that analogy, if you want to see persecuted, desperate settlers on Mars who left Earth for various reasons, because they wanted to look for something new, because they were persecuted, as mentioned, I think this only works if you have private companies who are supporting something like this for profit, because a governmental Mars mission, by a national space agency, would not support something like this.
In general, not. Although, who knows? You can never count on such things. I mean, the British on and off supported emigration to Palestine, but But yes, I'll concede the basic point that this does require significant private space capacity. And that is exactly what we're seeing right now. And by the way, it doesn't have to be people who are being persecuted to the point of death. The Pilgrims in Holland were not being persecuted to the point of death. Look, I don't think that the well of social thought is exhausted by the current age. I don't think that we've reached the ideal form of government. I think there will always be people who have new ideas and who, in general, will therefore not be popular and will want to have a place to go where they can give their ideas a try. So,
but let's first try to make ourselves at home and make ourselves at home in a sustainable way on Mars. So in order to make Mars livable, what technologies does it take to do so? What is necessary for us to make ourselves a home out there?
Okay. What is needed, okay, first and foremost, in any environment, are the technologies that allow you to take the materials there and turn them into resources. Okay, this is a very important point, and not just for Mars, but for understanding the development of civilization on Earth. There's actually no such thing as natural resources. There's only natural raw materials. It is technology, that is human creativity manifested in practical forms, that transforms materials into resources. The uranium was not a resource until we invented nuclear power. Oil wasn't a resource until we invented oil drilling and refining and machines that would run on the product. If you went to a meeting of the general staff of Napoleon Bonaparte and they were contemplating invading a country and someone was asked to list the natural resources of that country, they wouldn't have listed oil. Okay, to say nothing of uranium or even aluminum, which wasn't even known to science until 1820. Okay, because until you have electricity, you can't separate aluminum from aluminum oxide. Okay, and then, I mean, land wasn't even a resource until people invented agriculture. So the you know, I mean, what's land? It's just this thing you have to walk over. It has no intrinsic value. You know, any more than people right now consider the patches of the ocean of having intrinsic value in themselves. Now, so you have to be able to turn materials into resources. Now, so there's a lot of physical transformations involved in that. They all require energy, and that's why I come back to the nuclear reactor, okay, as one key to this. But there are also other things. Now, obviously, you have to be able to grow food. Now, this is an issue. For a Mars expedition, it's not an issue. You can just bring your food. It's not a problem at all. For a Mars base, it's not much of an issue. You can feed a Mars base of 20 or 40 people with greenhouses. But when you talk about a city, say 50,000 people, the size of Renaissance Florence, okay, putting aside a 1 million person metropolis, something else entirely, but just a respectable little city. Well, okay. Iowa farmland is the most productive agriculture at scale practiced on Earth today. And it grows a hectare of Iowa farmland, well farmed, will grow enough food to feed 30 people if all they eat is corn. Now, if they want to eat some meat, fruit, vegetables, 20 people. Okay, 20 people per hectare. So if you've got 20,000 people, that's 1,000 hectares. If you have 50,000 people, it's 2,500 hectares. That's a lot, okay? That's almost inconceivable to build greenhouses to do that. Or some people even talk about doing tunnel, and that's assuming that on Mars with half the solar flux, you'd have the same productivity as Iowa. Now, and some people talk about building tunnels and doing this underground with artificial lighting, and the power cost to that would be spectacular. So that is why I believe that some radically new ways of producing food will be needed. Okay, and you see the fundamental problem with food production on Earth. Okay, it's all ultimately based on photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is not efficient. At the level of chloroplast, the photosynthesis is 4% efficient. At the level of a cornfield, it's 0.2% efficient. And if you're feeding the corn to cows, it's 0.02% efficient. Okay, so to make protein from sunlight, it's 0.02% efficient. Now, okay, this is not good. As an engineer, I would say that a system that does that is not efficient. Now, chemical engineering systems are routinely, I mean, it depends on the process, but ballpark 30 to 70% efficient. Okay, 50% efficient, something like that. That's what you'd expect from a chemical engineering process. And some are 90%, but we'll settle for 50 here. Okay, so how can you produce proteins with that kind of efficiency? Well, you can produce things that are food for certain kind of microbes, such as methane and methanol, with efficiencies exceeding 80%. And then the microbes can transport that into protein with about 50% efficient. So now you're down to, like 40% efficient system producing protein. That protein is not that palatable. I mean, it's edible. But as a preference, you wouldn't regard it as something you'd really want. But you could feed it to fish, and they could convert it to fish at 50% efficiency. And now you're talking about 20% efficiency going from energy to fish. And so I think that something like this is going to need to be developed. So, and in terms of energy, okay, while the initial Mars base will be powered by fission, I think we will want to go to fusion. There's a lot of reasons for that. Deuterium, which is the fuel for fusion reactors, is 5 times as common on Mars as it is on Earth. The fission fuel, to make it, requires a very substantial industrial base in terms of refining the uranium, isotope enrichment, all this sort of stuff. Deuterium, you do have to enrich it, but it's vastly easier to enrich heavy hydrogen from light hydrogen. They differ by a factor of 2 in their atomic weight compared to isotopes of uranium, which differ by 3%, or actually more like 1.5% in weight. So the Martians are really going to want to have fusion power. And they're going to be driven to develop it for that reason. I mean, look, there are people putzing around with fusion power on Earth right now, but there's no societal urgency to it. We've got tons of fossil fuels. We have waterfalls. Yeah. We have the industrial base to do fission. Okay, but Mars is going to want this. And so you're talking about artificial food. You're talking about fusion power. The Martians are going to be driven to invent. And my parallel for this, and I discuss this a lot in my book, The New World on Mars, which is now out in both the United States and the UK. Penguin just published an edition in Britain, which might be more convenient for Europeans to get their hands on. Yeah. But look, take early America, okay? First of all, they developed 2 new sailing rigs, even in the 1600s. The sloop and the schooner were both developed in America, and they're both remarkable in that they required less hands to manage than the square rigs. But then the real breakthrough is steamboats. Now, the British had invented steam engines, and they were using them to pump water out of coal mines.
Coal mines, yeah.
Yes. Now, a steam engine used to pump water out of coal mines does not have to be efficient at all because you have an infinite supply of coal right there. And it's a stationary engine. It doesn't have to be compact or anything. But you put a steam engine on a boat, it has to be compact and it has to run on the fuel the boat can carry. It has to be efficient. And so the Americans were driven when they developed the steamboat, which they did because the only real highways that early America had were the rivers, and sailboats don't really do that well on rivers. You need steam. And so steam was the way. They're driven to high-pressure steam engines. That's how you can make them smaller and more efficient. And they did that, and that enabled not only steamboats, but then railroads, which are the transformative invention of the 19th century. So quite literally, the challenge of the frontier inspired the development of high-pressure, high-efficiency steam engines, which then enabled railroads, which is just transforms the world completely. So in the same way, the pressure of the frontier, and 2 other elements are needed besides pressure. One is a technologically adept population, which you had relatively so in early America. In fact, studies have been done of the immigrants to America in the 1700s. And oddly, substantial number of them were farmers, as you'd expect, because most of the people in England were farmers. But the next highest group, almost 50%, are artisans, carpenters, stonemasons, blacksmiths, people like this. And so this helps create the demographic that gives you this culture of gadgeteering in America. And you take that kind of people and you give them political freedom as well, creative freedom, and education, and give them the challenge of the frontier. They're going to do stuff. And I think that's what we're going to have on Mars. We're going to have a technologically adept population in a frontier environment, which they're going to be forced to innovate, and they will innovate.
And we got the transportation covered. We got the energy supply covered once it's developed sufficiently. We got food source covered. How about radiation? How big of a problem is that on Mars?
Okay, I'll answer that in a second, but I do want to complete one thing from our previous discussion, which is that this issue of food is so important that the Mars Society has started a contest, the Mars Against Hunger Prize, in which we're going to be giving out prizes for people who can demonstrate the best solution to this problem. And people can find all about this on the Mars Society website, marssociety.org.
Fantastic. So are you already receiving propositions?
I forget the exact due date, but they're going to have to submit the reports in the spring. And then the top 10 will be invited to come to the conference that we'll have next fall in Los Angeles to present live in front of a group of judges, and the awards will be decided on then.
And then the winners, what happens with the winning ideas?
They're going to get a cash prize. First prize is $10,000 and eternal glory. Second prize is $5,000 and eternal glory. And one of the conditions for entering the contest is this is being sponsored by the Mars Technology Institute, which is the institute that the Mars Society has set up in order to try to develop the technologies needed to settle Mars and spin them off for use on Earth, that the Mars Society be given the right to patent these processes. And if we do, then they would get a 1/3 interest in the patents. If we do not, they're free to patent it themselves.
Oh.
And here's the thing. In doing this, if we can solve this problem, what could be a better benefit for the people of the Earth, the poorest of the Earth, than a way of producing high-value protein at, 100 times the efficiency that it's currently being done? People all the time, they say, these space people, they don't care about the Earth's poor.
Right.
They just want to go play with rockets, right? Okay, well, we're going to show that this is just slander, that this is just nonsense, that, in fact, by taking on the challenge of space, we are going to create the solutions to the most important challenges of Earth. In fact, in certain ways, we've already done that. Where did solar energy come from? It came from the space program. And if solar energy proves to be a real problem solver for, curing global warming or whatever, then people will have gotten that from space. And if we can find a way to produce food at the efficiency that Mars settlement requires, people will have gotten the end of hunger on Earth from Mars.
Wow, that's huge. Wow. So when is the contest finishing next year?
Well, the contest will wind up at our convention in Los Angeles, which will be probably next September. It might be October. We're still arranging the dates.
So let's go back to the radiation issue. So is radiation, how much of a problem is it? Do we have technologies in place to mitigate this issue, or?
The radiation problem is overdrawn. The radiation dose on the Martian surface, the dose rate, is about the same as that at the International Space Station. That is, contrary to popular belief, the Earth's magnetic field does not shield us from cosmic rays. It doesn't. It's too weak. Cosmic ray, the people on the surface of the Earth are shielded by having the atmosphere above us, which is equivalent to having 10 meters of water above you in terms of its mass. On the space station, of course, you don't have that, but you do have the Earth below you, which shields out half the sky, as it were. Half the directions that cosmic rays could come to you are blocked by the Earth if you're in low Earth orbit. And so the dose rate at the space station is half that in interplanetary space, and the dose rate on the surface of Mars is also half that for the same reason. You have Mars under you. Now, that gets you to a dose rate which, while it is above regulatory standards, for, say, nuclear power plant workers, those standards are extremely conservative and have no relationship to casualties. There have been no radiological casualties from all of human activity in space to date. There have been zero gravity health effects, yes, but there have been no radiological health effects on any astronauts or cosmonauts. Now, now, if you do use what's called the linear no threshold methodology of evaluating radiation doses, and this is a methodology which is so conservative as to be simply fallacious. That is, the linear no threshold methodology says that if you get 1% of a fatal dose, you have a 1% chance of dying. So that's like, well, if you drank, 100 glasses of wine in one night, you'd probably die. But would you have a 1% chance of dying if you drink one glass of wine? No. If you drink one glass of wine per night for 100 nights, are you going to die? No. It has no relationship to it. But nevertheless, this is the methodology that is used. And if you were to adopt this methodology, there would be you get about 50 REMs going round trip to Mars. Actually, in a year on Mars, you'd get about 25 REMs. So in 2 years on Mars, you'd get about half of 1% a chance of dying of cancer at some point later in your life, if you believe in linear no threshold. So 4 years on Mars, you get a 1% chance that you would die of cancer at some point later in your life. The average American smoker increases anyone, a non-smoker, has a 20% chance of dying of cancer. If you're a smoker, it's 40. So it would take 80 years of living on Mars to develop the same risk. But that's if you're living on the surface. What if you're mostly living underground? How much of your day do you actually spend outside?
Yeah, of course.
Most people, it's perhaps 10%. That would be 2.5 hours outside. That would be above average, I would say, that someone spends outside. Farmers and construction workers, somewhat more, but office workers rather less. And unfortunately, children these days rather less. But so let's double that, make it 20%. Okay, spending 5 hours a day outside. That's definitely on the high side. Well, if the Martians were to live in houses that were mostly underground with just domed roofs outside, or a domed city that they can go into when they are, as it were, out of doors, that means that for 80% of their time, they would be completely shielded, and therefore the doses would be reduced by a factor of 5, and it would take not 80 years, but 400 years to get the same radiation hazard dose as an average American smoker.
We're usually imagining our extraterrestrial settlements as surface settlements. Where do you see us live on Mars, underground or above ground?
Well, I do see the basic city as being a surface city, okay? You wouldn't have domes, many kilometers in diameter, as you sometimes see in science fiction. you could have domes or things comparable to domes 100 meters in diameter, and then you could interlock them and travel from one to the other. This has to do with the effective pressure on structures, which gets bigger the bigger the structure is. But so you could have houses and everything, but your sleeping quarters would be underground. See, only part of the house would be above ground, the house within the dome. And then you could go outside and walk around the city and, enjoy the orchards and what have you. But say it was an average of 5 hours a day out of doors, the radiation dose would be negligible.
Elon Musk has been sporting a Nuke Mars T-shirt in public events now and then. I think he refers to forcing a greenhouse effect on Mars by nuclear detonations. Is this more than science fiction? Is this a realistic way to help us become Martians in the future?
It wouldn't work.
Okay.
The energy in nuclear bombs, as impressive as it is not enough to vaporize the Mars solar southern ice cap, which is mostly CO2. And it would take thousands of hydrogen bombs, and it would cause a significant fallout problem. Okay, and it still wouldn't work because the effect would be too temporary. The dry ice would recondense. Now, what would work, actually, though, is creating an artificial greenhouse effect on Mars. Using things that are more effective than CO2 as greenhouse gases. And there are two ways to do that. The way that I have proposed, along with people like Chris McKay and others who've studied this for some time, is to use fluorocarbon gases, which are extremely powerful greenhouse gases. And they, unlike chlorofluorocarbons, are immune to destruction by UV, and they don't damage ozone. We use them as refrigerants right now on Earth. But if you produce them on Mars at a rate that we produce all of these gases on Earth and the related chlorofluorocarbon gases, but didn't put them in refrigerators, just released them into the atmosphere for the purpose of doing global warming by intent, you could raise Mars's temperature by 10 degrees centigrade inside of 50 years.
Wow! How do you source those gases?
Well, the fluorine. Well, carbon's everywhere on Mars. Fluorine. Presumably, you'd want to find fluorine salts. Mars once had oceans. It had rivers. There should be salts, fluorine salts, just as there is on Earth. Now, more recently, there's been another idea put forward, which is extremely interesting. This was just put forward in the past year by a team, international team, the most prominent member of it in terms of being public with it is a University of Chicago professor named Edward Kite. And their idea is to create iron nanoparticles and basically iron dust and spread it into the atmosphere. And interestingly, this also has very strong optical effects of reflecting the ultraviolet back down onto the surface. Okay, so it's a greenhouse gas, but made from iron. Now, there's no question that iron is available everywhere on Mars. That's why the planet is red from rust. So this definitely takes away the question about where you're going to find the fluorine. You can definitely find the iron. Now, it takes energy. You got to break up the iron oxide and to make iron particles, but it's not excessive. The amounts of energy are comparable to that in the fluorocarbon scheme, something like 5 gigawatts, which is about the same amount of power that powers Chicago. So, I mean, it's a lot more power than you have at a Mars base, but it's not like 70 times the power the human race currently consumes or something of this nature. The So, so this is a very interesting idea, and does open the way. So now you greenhouse Mars. Okay, so you warm Mars using either fluorocarbons or iron particles, and you raise it 10 centigrade. Now, if you did that, yes, you would vaporize that polar cap and keep it vaporized. And furthermore, not just that, but there's much larger amounts of CO2 that is soaked into Mars's soil globally. Okay, and this would cause that to outgas. And so there's much more effective than bombing the pole. And you could thicken Mars's atmosphere from its current thickness of about 1% Earth up to about perhaps 30% Earth. And that's the same pressure as you have, for instance, on Mount Everest. Now, on Mount Everest, okay, people can walk around wearing oxygen masks. They don't need pressure suits. The air has thinned out, but if you enrich its oxygen percentage, you get the same amount of oxygen at lower pressure by having 100% oxygen in the mask, or you actually have more oxygen than you have right now if you're sitting at sea level, or I have that where I'm getting about 85% sea level oxygen, or Colorado. But so at that point, on this Mars, people could walk around outside without spacesuits. They would just need warm clothing and oxygen masks, just kind of like on Everest.
And those, just for a second, these gases and the iron particles, they would not escape into space. They would stay within the already existing thin atmosphere and enrich it.
Yes, they would. They're heavier than CO2 in that space in Mars' atmosphere. Yeah. So this would warm the place up, but you would have an atmosphere which is overwhelmingly CO2. Now, you'd start to get water vapor as well, because with this temperature rise, the temperature, at least in the more tropical regions of Mars, would be above the freezing average, would be above the freezing point of water year round. So you would get liquid water. The rivers on Mars would flow again. The lakes would fill with water. Oceans would be reconstituted, and you'd have rain, which would do a lot to destroy the peroxides that are in the Martian surface, because they break down on contact with water. And that would release small amounts of oxygen into Mars's atmosphere. But basically, you'd have an atmosphere which plants could accept, but not humans. But if you spread enough plants, okay, then by photosynthesis, they could increase the percentage of oxygen in that atmosphere to the point where it becomes breathable, first by the simple animals, then insects, and then eventually humans as well.
Would plants grow? So if I threw a bunch of seeds into Martian soil under enough humidity, etc., would plants be able to grow?
Under those circumstances, yes. And especially since these plants, you'd have humans actively bioengineering them to ensure that they would be well adapted to this environment. And that would also be key to accelerate the process. We're talking about a project that's being done perhaps 100 years from now. And presumably by this time, biotechnology is going to be a big thing in the 21st century. We've learned how to read the genetic code. We're learning how to write it. So, I mentioned that chloroplasts are 4% efficient. There was a time when they were less efficient, actually. And in principle, they could be made more efficient, or alternative biological items created that would be more efficient. So it's not inconceivable that people 100 years from now will be able to engineer photosynthetic organisms that are considerably more efficient than those that we are currently presented with. And that would greatly accelerate the process.
Who writes the rules for Mars? Is this the Wild West all over again? Going back to governmentality?
Mars will be ruled by the Martians. I could point out the fact that the Outer Space Treaty, the governments of Earth have officially declared that they will not attempt to exert sovereignty on extraterrestrial objects. So the people who say that the Outer Space Treaty bans the settlement of Mars have it exactly backwards. The Outer Space Treaty guarantees that people who will settle Mars will be outside the jurisdiction of terrestrial governments. Although I would imagine that a Mars base set up by, say, the United States would be under U.S. jurisdiction. The planet itself is not. And so basically, I mean, you do have to have laws. You can't have anarchy. Property titles only exist in the presence of governments. The reason why I own my house is I have a certificate that I can show to the police. So if some people try to move into my house, I can have the police throw them out. Your ownership of anything is fundamentally based on the fact that there's a group of armed men who will honor your certificate that says it's yours and not anyone who wants to take it. So we're going to need government on Mars, but that government, I believe, will be set up by the various colonies themselves. And people sometimes ask me, well, what kind of government is going to be on Mars? And I think there'll be many different kinds of governments on Mars. I think that different groups of people will emigrate to Mars with very different ideals as to what the ideal society should be and what the ideal government should be. And they'll give their ideas a spin. And those that prove to be unworkable, those colonies will either change their ideas or they will fade and die.
So there will be a bunch of experimental settlements.
They might not regard themselves as experiments, but from the point of view of history, that's exactly what they are. They're experiments in governance and social forms. And those that do the best will outgrow the rest.
Yeah.
And they will become the model, not just for Mars, but I believe for Earth, because the great attractor that they're going to have, why would someone move to Mars? They'll move to Mars if it's got something to offer that's better than what they've got where they are.
What if Elon Musk has shown time and again, and for very recently with his X/Twitter, that he's willing to rewrite the rule books on these platforms, speaking, of course, of the freedom of speech. And this freedom of speech, in my opinion, in my reading, leans toward, I don't know, is anarchism too far-fetched? I don't know about this, but what if this guy put 100 starships in place with 100 folks and brings them to Mars to set up shop and build up a settlement along those rules? Is this a viable option?
Well, history will tell. Look, the Americas were opened up to Europeans by Inquisition Spain. They're the ones who funded Columbus. All right? But, the Spanish then had their colonies, the French had their colonies, the British had their colonies. The British colonies and then the United States outran these places because they became more attractive places to settle. The reason why I'm speaking to you in English right now instead of French is that despite the fact that France had 4 times the population of England in the 16 and 1700s, the British colonies grew much faster because they were built as communities, they with churches and schools and all of this. And so British women were willing to emigrate to these colonies, whereas the French colonies were set up as for-profit trading posts. And they were also under direct domination of the Catholic Church. They didn't allow Jesuits there. They didn't allow Huguenots there. but please, they absolutely did allow Jesuits, but not Huguenots. Who would have been happy to go, but were not allowed. And French women in general were not interested in going to these sorts of places. The aspirations of women in this time period was primarily to raise families in communities, and so as a result of this. by 1750, when the decisive struggle occurred between Britain and France for control of North America, there were 2 million English-speaking people in North America and 50,000 French. And that, of course, determined the outcome. And then after America achieved independence, okay, this was the place where immigrants wanted to go from Europe, okay? And within the United States, okay, there were two very different social systems in the North and in the South. In the North, we had a system based on free labor using ingenuity to develop technology to multiply the power of labor. In other words, the United States had its basic problem was severe labor shortage. In the North, it was developed through ingenuity and technology addressed this. In the South, it was addressed through slavery. And as a result, the North outgrew the South. If you ask any Civil War buff why the North won the Civil War, they would say, well, because they had a larger population and more industry. And that's true. But why did they have a larger population and more industry? It's because they were free. Okay, 40% of the Northern Army was either immigrants or first-generation Americans. Only 3% of the Confederate Army was. So the immigrants will go where they can be free. And so that is why I believe, by the way, that the generic science fiction trope of the extraterrestrial tyranny is unrealistic, because any extraterrestrial tyranny would die on the vine, because who would want to emigrate to one? Exactly.
That's a very strong point.
And therefore, your question about Musk, okay, who obviously has an extremely strong personality, arguably sort of a Bonapartist type personality. Could he set up a colony on Mars? Yeah, he might. But it would only outgrow the rest if it was a free colony that offered more
benefits.
Chance for humans to manifest their inherent potential than the alternatives. If it did not, it would be outgrown. And the ditto, for if China sets up its colony or whoever, the freedom is going to win this one because it has more to sell.
So it's a more Darwinian approach, and to leave it over to evolution and survival of the most appropriate model. Yeah. So who would we send? Would you leave it up to the ones with the largest wallets, or should we select for certain character traits? We had in a recent episode on this show, we had Loretta Hidalgo Whitesides from Virgin Galactic, and we were discussing how to find the proper human to send to Mars to represent us, and how difficult it is, because who says what is wrong and what is right. So who would you send? Who would we send?
Well, I think that if we're talking Mars settlement in the way that I've discussed it, who goes would be decided by the various groups that are launching their various settlements. Now, and then once the settlements are established, who is admitted would be based on what the Martian settlers, okay, who do we want for immigrants, you might say. Okay. Now, this is also an interesting question. This is a very similar question to what people talk about in the immigration debate here in the United States right now. I do believe that early Martian city-states, and I do believe city-states are probably the form of social organization that these places will be, will need a considerable degree of solidarity in order to get by. That is, while I do believe that they will need to be free, there will need to be a fair amount, a large amount of social cohesion. And it's just somewhat in tension with liberty in its pure, unrestricted sense. Now, there's two ways that can be achieved, okay? One is you have people all come from the same sect or whatever, and you can get pretty good social solidarity that way. But such societies will tend to be small because they can only draw from a narrow demographic. And therefore, I believe that the melting pot model, the one that welcomes all or nearly all, but can effectively assimilate them to a common identity on Mars.
Very interesting, because if I understand you correct, this is what we're experiencing currently on Earth, in especially in our Western societies, that our societies are renewing or adapting to migration patterns, migration needs for various reasons. And so what is happening here is a reorganization of societies. And the same may hold true for Mars or other extraterrestrial places. So I'm just pointing that out to get a feeling as to how fast and how slow something like this is happening, because we are essentially also experiencing this sort of Darwinian reorganization of our own societies. Does this make sense?
Yeah, it does. But here's the thing, okay? As I say, the Martian societies, I don't believe the multicultural model works on Mars. You can't have a city-state that is divided into different groups who identify with their own group and not with the city as a whole. Yeah. It's a formula for disaster. But it does have to be welcoming. It has to be a format that does allow people to join it. I think, frankly, historically, one of the great strengths, if not the greatest strength of the United States, has been its ability to do that. I think it's demonstrated a better ability to do that than, for instance, European countries. That is, you can become American, but you cannot become a Pole. You cannot be, it's very difficult to become a German. It's very difficult to become French. But you can become an American very easily, and it means something. Frankly, one of the great problems I have with the Trump movement is its rejection of that tradition. And why I do not believe that it is a conservative movement at all. It's a nativist movement. It's not the same thing. Because it rejects one of America's most important traditions. But this is definitely going to be the challenge. But the challenge of the Martian city-states, whether they know it or not, okay, whether they know it or not, whether they acknowledge it or not, is they will be in competition for immigrants. They will be in competition for immigrants with each other, and they will be in competition for immigrants with the various societies of the Earth. Okay? And the one that makes itself the most attractive will draw the most immigrants, and it will grow and prosper and become an example to humanity everywhere. And this is fundamental to how we progress. Democracy. The ideas that created America were not created in America. The 18th century liberalism was widely understood by intellectual circles in Europe, certainly. But they couldn't implement it there. There were too many existing institutions in the way. We're able to give it a try, imperfect form, but nevertheless a try. Founders called it a noble experiment. It worked. It worked so well that not only did millions of immigrants come to America and the place became a superpower, but it became an example so that right now democracy is the standard. And even countries that are not democratic pretend that they are, because you have to at least pretend that you are to be a respectable country.
Like currently we're doing everything to get rid of democracy again. But I hear you.
By democracy, I don't mean mob rule. I mean liberty under law,
Yeah.
constitutional governance. Democracy, unfortunately, the word has it has two meanings.
Do you see Mars as the beginning of a planet B, or is it still so that extraterrestrial habitation is in itself too complex, too complicated, and too inhospitable compared to our own paradise we live in?
Okay. I reject this idea of Mars as this place that we should settle it so that there's some survivors after the Earth is destroyed. The argument is, first of all, technically false, but it's also morally repellent. We don't go to Mars in order to desert the Earth. We go to Mars or to desert the human race. We go to Mars in order to expand the capacity of the human race, to create new branches of human civilization, which side by side with terrestrial civilization will continue to innovate, continue to invent, continue to open new frontiers. Okay. I mean, yes, some individuals fled Europe for America in order to have a place where they could be. But conceived of as a historic project, the idea was not to have a place where Western civilization could survive after Europe was destroyed. Conceived of from the point of view of the overall project of Western civilization, it was a project that immensely enhanced and expanded the capacity of Western civilization and human civilization to deal with all sorts of things. And so, it's not we're deserting Earth to go to Mars. It's that we're going to Mars to expand the capacity of the human race, and not just to deal with threats like asteroids, which of course a spacefaring humanity can deal with, and a non-spacefaring humanity cannot. But to deal with all sorts of things. I mean, you think of, say, COVID. Okay. Some of the vaccines came from Europe, some came from America. The fact that there was more players in the game enhanced our capacity to deal with that crisis. And, what if COVID had been a much more deadly disease? Then certainly the fact that we had more players in more countries working on this, able to work on this, okay, would increase our survival chance.
Barbara Belvisi of Interstellar Labs, I don't know if you know her.
I do.
And on this show, she argued that she sees our role as humans to help life to become interplanetary. So we humans, we're developing technology as a vessel to help life leave the planet and distribute itself in the universe. What do you make of that?
I agree with that. I believe that humans are not the enemies of life. Humans are the vanguards of life.
Fantastic. If the call came, Dr. Zubrin, today, that there is a Starship leaving next week for Mars, would you go?
Although I must say I don't expect that call, and it's not in expectation of that call that I have put in all this work to try to make Humans to Mars happen. It is, for me, the space venture is not, oh, gee, if only I could go to space and look at the Earth out the window of the spaceship. Sure, I'd love to do that. That'd be great fun. But that, to me, that's not my driving motivation. My driving motivation is, I only going to live once. I want to do something significant with my life. And I think this is the most significant thing that's being done in our time.
I'd like to ask you a question that I keep asking every guest on this show. Because we're building up a playlist on Spotify for the aspiring space traveler. And so my question to you, if you decide to go to Mars, you will understand that this, after the first weeks of excitement have worn off, is essentially also a boring journey to this place because it takes a while. So my question to you is, what one piece of music would you not want to miss on that journey? And you can pick one tune, which I will then upload or add to the Spotify playlist. That was a quick one. Fantastic. And my last question, this place is called the Space Cafe Podcast. It's a coffee place, so to say. And now and then you go to coffee places to energize yourself with an espresso. Now I challenge you to energize us, to energize the audience with an espresso for the mind, a shot of inspiration. And you can pick whatever kind of topic you want to pick.
So I'm not exactly sure of the sort of thing you're looking for, but I'd ask them to think about if they could create a society with a clean sheet of paper, okay, and could take all the best from Earth and leave all the worst behind, what would it be? Think about that. Because we're going to have a chance to do that. We have it in our power to begin the world anew.
Fantastic. This is exactly what I was looking for. Dr. Robert Zubrin, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I greatly enjoyed this conversation.
And that's a wrap, my friends, for today's episode. What a journey it's been again with Dr. Robert Zubrin. From nuclear reactors to food production, from governance to new societies. We've gone far beyond rockets and landings in this episode. And because the vision isn't about planting flags, it's about expanding human civilization itself. We're not leaving Earth behind, we're expanding our human portfolio. And this is really where the fun starts, where things get interesting. Want to learn more about all this? I highly recommend checking out the Mars Society. Find everything online, of course. Find us on LinkedIn and Reddit, and find the links in the show notes. And if you enjoyed the show, my friends, leave us a rating. Help us reach more space enthusiasts just like you. And until our next conversation in 2 weeks from now, stay curious. Keep looking up, my friends. And keep in mind that sometimes the biggest challenges aren't about getting there. It's all about what we do once we arrive. Bye for now.